veil of dust rose when the wooden lid slid back, as though the chest itself exhaled after a century of holding its breath. Inside, wrapped in brittle linen that had yellowed like old teeth, lay the artifact that would set the entire investigation in motion. It was small enough to fit in 2 hands, yet heavy in a way that suggested more than weight. Something tighter, darker, compressed beneath time and silence. The brass plate on its top was tarnished, but the inscription was unmistakable once light struck it at the proper angle. Property record Lot 47, Amherst County Auction, 1856. The archivist who discovered it later said she felt a cold spot on the floorboards beneath her feet, as though some unseen pocket of winter had pooled there. The chest had been hidden beneath a false plank in a house long abandoned, a place where window glass had surrendered to vines and the roof sagged like a tired lung. Yet the record inside, and the secrets attached to it, were very much alive. Lot 47. The most expensive female slave ever auctioned in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Her selling price alone was enough to unsettle anyone familiar with the period. Nearly triple the usual value. Astronomical for a woman, unheard of outside specialized whispered markets. But the true shock came from the accompanying note, written in a meticulous, looping hand that trembled only at its margins. Hold her until the bishop arrives. Do not let her speak. No name, no description, no explanation. Only the record of a price so high it reeked of desperation or fear. As historians and investigators pulled at the thread, a tapestry of long-buried violence unraveled. A plantation family whose wealth hid a secret lineage. A bishop whose sermons flirted with forbidden theology. A body count that contradicted every public record. And witnesses whose testimonies were quickly erased by fire, accident, or disappearance. The more one searched, the more it became clear. Lot 47 was a cipher. Whoever she was, whatever she carried, had been worth killing for. Before we continue with the story of Lot 47 and the impossible secret she carried into that Virginia auction block, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The record takes us back to the spring of 1856, when Virginia lay at the uneasy crossroads of wealth and dread. The plantations were lush that year, dense with the promise of tobacco and wheat, their green rows combed by wind and overseers with equal precision. In the mornings, mist crawled up from the James River like a living thing, drifting between sycamore trunks and rolling over fields where enslaved hands bent beneath the weight of harvests not their own. Wagons creaked along dirt roads that were packed hard by generations of footsteps, some voluntary, most not. The smell of smoke from hearth fires mingled with the iron tang of wet soil, a scent familiar enough to every Virginian, free or enslaved, to be mistaken for nature itself. Towns were growing, though not quickly enough to outpace the tension. Lynchburg's brick storefronts bustled with commerce, while Richmond's Capitol Square filled each day with political murmurs, arguments about states' rights, rumblings about abolitionist agitation trickling south. Newspapers printed defensive editorials one day and anxious reports the next. Church bells rang on Sundays through streets that echoed with competing visions of morality, some sincere, others sharpened into weapons. In the countryside, life followed an older rhythm. The great estates still cast long shadows, their columns rising like pale sentinels guarding ancient sins. Families whose names held weight in the region governed their lands with a mixture of pride, discipline, and paranoia. Slavery was not merely an economic institution there, it was the spine of daily life, the unspoken logic beneath every transaction, every whispered fear about rebellion or divine judgment. That spring brought heat early. By late April, the air in Amherst County grew thick enough that even the cicadas seemed to rasp with effort. The auction block near the courthouse stood waiting for the season's first major sale. Men in waistcoats fanned themselves with folded broadsheets, and women pressed handkerchiefs to their temples as they pretended not to stare at the human beings corralled behind the high wooden fence. The smell of sweat mingled with dust, and the faint sweetness of magnolias blooming farther down the road. Merchants, planters, and itinerant buyers gathered, most of them familiar with one another, all of them confident in the routines of commerce. It was a grim ritual, but one so deeply embedded in the region's economy that few questioned it aloud. The auctioneer, a broad man in suspenders with a voice polished by years of shouting prices, adjusted his books and chuckled with a neighbor about the stubborn mule he'd tried selling the week before. Yet, even then, beneath the veneer of routine, whispers had begun to drift. Travelers passing through Lynchburg claimed that a buyer from Charleston was asking after a particular girl. A carriage arriving from the east had been seen at odd hours outside the courthouse, and several enslaved men working the stables murmured of a wagon arriving just before dawn, its back covered by thick canvas and guarded by strangers who refused to speak with anyone. The courthouse clock struck 10. The auction began. Ordinary lots came first: field hands, a carpenter, a mother with 2 small children. Hard lives measured in numbers, debt, and profit. The crowd watched with a detachment of men purchasing tools. But then the sheriff approached the platform and handed the auctioneer a sealed envelope. Whatever was inside seemed to drain the color from the man's face. He glanced at the sheriff, who gave a curt nod, and then cleared his throat louder than necessary. "There is one more lot, not listed in the papers." A murmur rolled through the buyers. The wooden gate creaked open. No one stepped out. Instead, 2 deputies guided forward a veiled figure, slender, bound at the wrists, head bowed so low the brim of the bonnet concealed everything except the faint outline of her chin. The fabric of her dress, plain but clean, suggested careful preparation rather than poverty. She did not stumble, did not resist, but her stillness held a tension that unsettled even men accustomed to reading the bodies of the enslaved. A buyer near the front whispered, "Who is she?" Another muttered, "Never seen her on any ledger." Behind the auctioneer, the sheriff stood with an expression carved from stone. The auctioneer lifted a trembling hand. Lot 47, special circumstances." Someone called out, "What's her skill?" Another asked, "Where's she from?" But the auctioneer ignored them. He opened the bidding at a price so high the crowd fell instantly silent, a number no woman had ever reached in that county, or any nearby. Laughter erupted at first, then confusion, then calculation. Because one man, standing beneath the shade of a broad-brimmed hat, raised his hand immediately. A second man, wealthy, familiar, feared, called out a higher sum without hesitation. A third stranger, dressed like a clergyman, spoke next. The deputies tightened their grip on the veiled woman. She lifted her head, and though her face remained hidden, several in the crowd swore years later that they felt her gaze like a pressure inside their skulls. Quiet, heavy, aware. The bidding rose, fevered, irrational, dangerous. When the hammer finally fell, the price exceeded anything ever recorded for a woman in Virginia. But the real shock came after. For the winning bidder, whose name appeared nowhere in the newspaper announcements, was escorted directly into the courthouse by the sheriff, document in hand, as though the sale itself required legal quarantine. Behind him, the veiled woman was ushered not to the stables or the holding pens, but through a side door normally reserved for judges. And then all records of her vanished, except for the artifact discovered more than a century later. Lot 47. Her price was extraordinary, but the secret she carried was impossible. The Virginia of 1856 was a place where beauty and brutality lived side by side, each pretending not to notice the other. Travelers arriving from the north spoke in letters of landscapes so lush they seemed designed by a generous god. Rolling hills stitched with vineyards, orchards dripping with peaches, and fields of tobacco swaying like green seas under the wind. But beneath that pastoral stillness lay a society wired tight with anxiety, its wealth stacked atop the backs and bones of those who could never claim it. Most plantations sat miles apart, separated by dense forests of oak, pine, and walnut. At dawn, the world smelled of sap, river mist, and wood smoke curling from chimneys that seemed to greet the rising sun with thin gray fingers. Birds called from the branches, cardinals, thrushes, and mockingbirds, whose songs were bright enough to deceive a stranger into thinking the land peaceful. Yet anyone who lived there knew the truth. The nights belonged to a different kind of sound. When the sun dipped away, the warm winds shifted, carrying the low murmur of enslaved quarters settling into uneasy rest, the strains of distant hymns sung beneath breath, and the curt barks of overseers making their final rounds. Sometimes there was only silence, and that quiet carried its own warnings. Too much silence could rouse suspicion in the white families who listened for signs of rebellion. Too little drew punishment the next morning. The social hierarchy of the time was rigid, brittle, and fiercely defended. Wealthy landowners attended church in polished boots, their wives swathed in fabrics imported from Charleston or Baltimore, their sermons laced with scripture designed to justify the very system that fed their prosperity. Slavery was spoken of as an inheritance, a duty, a tradition, never a choice. In parlors lit by whale oil lamps, men debated the future of the Union with growing unease, insisting that Northern agitators understood nothing of the Southern way of life. In Richmond, where political currents swirled with more speed, taverns filled with arguments over newspaper editorials. Some men predicted disunion, others laughed at the idea, and still, beneath the bravado, lingered the same dread that seeped through the rural counties, an unspoken fear that something was shifting beneath the surface, something vast enough to break apart the world they knew. Amherst County itself was a curious mixture of old families and transient workers. The courthouse sat at the center like a hive, drawing farmers, merchants, judges, and drifters into its orbit. Brick storefronts lined the main street, apothecaries with shelves of bitter tinctures, milliners displaying bonnets on wooden mannequins, butchers whose windows fogged with the heat of fresh cuts, the scent of tobacco cured in barns at the edge of town, thick and sweet enough to coat a person's throat after a few minutes outdoors. Children darted between wagons, their laughter sharp and fleeting. Horses stamped at troughs, snorting into the humid air. Preachers stood at the corners on Saturdays, warning of sin while ignoring the human auctions conducted only steps away. And always, always in the background, the quiet machinery of plantation life continued without pause. Harvesting, hauling, mending, suffering. In the enslaved quarters, the world felt markedly different. Nights were heavy with the smoke of small cooking fires, the scent of salted pork and beans, and the rustle of cloth as mothers lulled tired children to sleep after grueling days in the fields. Stories passed from elder to youth, stories of survival, of far-off freedom, of spirits powerful enough to intervene when men would not. Faith was woven into the rhythms of life, a lifeline carried in whispered prayers and hidden songs. It was in this environment, half shadow, half smile, that rumors began to trickle in weeks before the auction of Lot 47. A traveling minister passing through Lynchburg spoke of a troublesome girl being transported under armed guard. No one could say where she'd come from. Another rumor claimed she had been found wandering in the woods, speaking in a language no one recognized. Others insisted she had been taken from a wealthy family's private holding, a possession not meant for public sale, but forced into the open by some urgent, dangerous circumstance. Still others dismissed her entirely, blaming the rumor on idle talk from field hands who often embroidered tales to relieve the monotony of labor. But the whispers persisted, taking on a new edge when a courier arrived from Richmond carrying sealed documents for the sheriff. Documents that, according to the clerk who saw them exchanged, bore the unmistakable crest of one of Virginia's most powerful families. Then, as the date of the auction approached, the air itself seemed to tighten. Even the weather became unpredictable. Storms rolled in from the west with unusual swiftness, slashing fields with sudden rain and disappearing just as quickly. Old farmers muttered that the sky was restless. Women in town clutched their shawls tighter, glancing at shadows as though expecting them to move. On one humid evening, where the breeze carried the smell of honeysuckle and something metallic beneath it, a group of men gathered outside the tavern spoke in hushed tones about strangers spotted near the river. Strangers dressed not like laborers but like officials or clergy. One man, a barrel-chested blacksmith with soot ground permanently into the creases of his hands, swore he saw one of them carrying a leather case with brass latches, the kind used to transport surgical instruments. The others laughed him off until he added, "He walked with purpose, like he was late for something sacred." By the time dawn finally broke on auction day, the county felt tense enough that even the birds seemed unsure whether to sing. Yet nothing, not the rumors, not the weather, not the arrivals of out-of-town carriages, prepared anyone for the sight of the veiled woman escorted onto the platform. Nothing hinted at the secret so strange, so impossible, that her price would become the highest ever recorded for a woman in the Commonwealth, and still not equal the value of what she carried within her silence. And in the days that followed, as her trail disappeared behind courthouse walls, the people of Amherst County found themselves caught in a tightening web of fear, curiosity, and dread. For this was not simply the story of a woman sold. It was the beginning of something darker. They called him Master Edwin Harrow before they ever called him suspect. In the years leading up to the sale of Lot 47, his name floated through Amherst County like a stone dropped into deep water, visible only by the ripples it left behind. He was the heir to one of the region's oldest plantation families, born into a legacy that traced itself back to English gentry. His estate, Harrow's Field, sat perched on a hill that overlooked the river bends, its columns tall enough to cast shadows like bars across the front lawn each afternoon. Edwin Harrow was not a large man, nor particularly broad, yet there was something in the way he carried himself, chin lifted just a degree too high, eyes lingering too long on anyone who dared challenge him, that suggested an internal architecture built on entitlement and secrecy. His hair, dark and wavy, fell neatly to his collar. His coat, always immaculate, bore the faint smell of bay rum and tobacco. He seldom raised his voice, but when he did, it came out with the controlled sharpness of a man who believed control was a virtue ordained by Providence. To the townspeople he was almost an ornament, a wealthy bachelor, polite in public, generous at church, and always aloof. To those who worked on his land, he was something else entirely. His quietness felt dangerous. His moments of compassion came unpredictably, then vanished like fog. Some days he walked the fields himself, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting rows of tobacco with almost religious focus. Other days he locked himself in his study for hours, emerging with bloodshot eyes and hands trembling faintly at the fingertips. But it was his voice, low, deliberate, always measured, that lingered in memory. One evening, months before the auction, he summoned Jacob, an enslaved man who served as his driver. Edwin stood near the veranda railing, gazing across the fields, the sun setting behind him like a smoldering coal. "Jacob," he said softly, "have you ever known a moment where silence felt alive?" Jacob blinked, unsure how to answer. "No, sir." Edwin nodded, though the response seemed to disappoint him. "Then perhaps it is only me." He turned away, muttering something too faint for Jacob to hear, something that sounded less like a question and more like a confession. Those close to him whispered that Edwin's behavior had changed drastically in the year leading up to Lot 47's arrival. He paced at night. He kept a lantern burning until dawn. He requested shipments of books that no plantation owner ordinarily read. Treatises on theology, monographs on African cosmology, and even, according to a merchant in Richmond, a translation of an obscure medieval text on exorcism. When asked why he needed such material, Edwin simply smiled with a softness that never reached his eyes. "Curiosity," he murmured, "and perhaps preparation." But the man most directly connected to Lot 47 was not Edwin Harrow. It was Bishop Silas Armitage. A towering figure in both height and reputation, Bishop Armitage moved between pulpits and plantations with equal authority. His sermons were famous for their thunderous cadence, his doctrine steeped in the conviction that order, strict, unwavering order, was the only thing standing between the South and divine punishment. He wore a long black coat even in the heat of July, his collar starched to a stiffness that seemed to choke the very breath from him. His hair, silver at the temples, gave him the look of a man carved from stone, as though age feared to touch him fully. People listened when Silas Armitage spoke. They didn't always understand him, but they listened. His relationship with the Harrow family went back decades, to the christenings of children who never survived childhood, to funerals conducted before bodies cooled, to private gatherings in the Harrow Library, where the bishop's voice echoed through the halls long past midnight. Servants spoke of the bishop's visits with unease. They said he never looked at people, only through them. They said he smelled faintly of myrrh and gunpowder. They said he often carried a leather-bound journal filled with diagrams that were not of Scripture, diagrams that showed circles, symbols, and lines intersecting like wounds on a map. His voice, deep and unyielding, could make even grown men feel as though they were children before a stern father. Once, after delivering a sermon warning of spiritual corruption hidden among the meek, he stepped down from the pulpit and approached a woman waiting to exit the sanctuary. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do not trust anything that pretends to be harmless," he told her, his words slow and heavy. "Even lambs bleed when the wolf finally comes." "Yes, Bishop," she whispered. He smiled then. A thin, unsettling arc. "Good. Very good." In the weeks before Lot 47's auction, Bishop Armitage was seen meeting privately with the sheriff, with Edwin Harrow, and with at least 2 men who arrived from Richmond in a coach bearing no family crest. After each visit, the bishop emerged looking more fatigued, his rigid posture slumping slightly, as though he carried a burden that pressed into his very bones. But he always straightened himself before stepping into public view. "God's work requires endurance," he told the sheriff one evening on the courthouse steps. The sheriff replied, "Is this truly God's work, Bishop?" Silas Armitage paused. "All things are God's work," he said, "even the ones that test us." There was a tremor in his voice then, just a thread, but the sheriff remembered it years later with dread. The third central figure in the story of Lot 47 was not a man of wealth or clergy, but a young enslaved woman named Naomi. She lived on the adjacent plantation, the Carter estate, separated from Harrow's field by nothing more than a stretch of forest and a narrow river branch. Naomi was 22, slender, quick-footed, with eyes bright enough that even the overseer occasionally softened his tone when speaking to her. But it wasn't her beauty that made her significant. It was her hearing. Naomi caught things, not in the way others did, through stray words or rumors. She caught tones, pauses, breaths. She could listen from across a yard and understand an entire argument. She could hear a whispered conversation behind a closed door and repeat it back with uncanny accuracy. Many of the enslaved on the Carter estate trusted her with secrets, but even more feared what she might overhear, and what the masters might do if they discovered she possessed such a gift. One winter night, Naomi overheard a conversation between the Carter overseer and two strangers who had arrived by horseback. She hid in the shadows near the tool shed, hands pressed against her chest to quiet the rhythm of her breath. A stranger spoke first. The bishop said the girl must be moved before the equinox. The Harrow man is losing resolve. The overseer grunted. Resolve or sanity? A pause, then a cold, humorless laugh. What's left of either? Naomi backed away slowly, her heart thundering. She didn't know who they meant, not yet, but she knew danger when she heard it. The next morning, she told an elderly woman in the quarters, Miss Ada, what she'd heard. Ada closed her eyes tight. Child, she whispered, some names best not spoken, and some secrets ain't meant for our ears. Naomi leaned closer. But what if someone is in trouble? Ada shook her head. Someone is always in trouble, but this? Her voice dropped to a breath. This feel like trouble that don't want witnesses. Naomi didn't understand the full meaning of her words until the day she saw the veiled woman, Lot 47, being led through the courthouse door. Edwin Harrow watched her with something like terror. Bishop Armitage watched her with something like recognition. And Naomi watched all of them, realizing with chilling clarity that her quiet gift might entangle her in a story far darker than any she had ever imagined. The first signs did not come with screams or gunshots or flaming torches cutting through the night. They came quietly, too quietly, like threads of cold air seeping through cracks in a house that everyone believed was sealed. 3 days after the auction of Lot 47, a farmhand reported hearing singing in the woods behind Harrow's field. At first, he assumed it was the quarterfolk holding a prayer circle after dusk. The sound rose and fell in gentle waves, the rhythm slow enough to soothe the nerves of any weary listener. But the melody was wrong, too clean, too precise, lacking the familiar cadence of spirituals sung among the enslaved. And worse, it was sung in a voice that did not belong to anyone he knew. A girl's voice. High, thin, and strangely steady, like someone singing from a distance deeper than the forest itself. He told no one until the next morning, when he found footprints leading from the tree line toward the back road that wound past the Harrow estate. Bare footprints, small. The earth around them was disturbed in a way that suggested the walker paused several times, as if listening for something. Or someone. The same morning, the sheriff discovered that the courthouse ledger from auction day, where every sale had been recorded in pristine ink, was missing. Only a small scrap remained where the page had been torn out, the fibers ripped with such force they frayed like grass chewed by livestock. On the scrap was a single notation. 47 hold until arrival. Below it, faint as a sigh, a second line. She knows. The sheriff stood over the torn page with a prickling sensation crawling up his spine. He told himself it was anger. He told himself he'd find which clerk mishandled the record. But late that night, long after he finished his supper, he lit a candle and stared at the remaining scrap again, reading it over and over until the flame guttered. She knows what? At Harrow's field, the signs grew stranger. Edwin Harrow dismissed most of the staff the day after the auction. Not fired, dismissed. Sent home early with a clipped explanation, the house requires privacy until further notice. No one dared refuse him. Edwin's voice carried the sharpness of a man unraveling but determined to keep the threads concealed. And that evening, a lone lantern burned in the south wing, a part of the house seldom used except to store old furniture and forgotten heirlooms. The light moved intermittently, as if someone inside paced from window to window. Naomi, returning from an errand to the Harrow estate, paused on the road and stared at the distant glow through the trees. She heard it then. A soft tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Not from the house itself, but from the woods behind her. The pattern repeated, a sequence of 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps, a longer pause, then 3 again. Naomi swallowed hard, her breath thinning. She'd heard men knock signals like that before, overseers coordinating a hunt for runaways. But this wasn't that rhythm. It wasn't even close. It sounded like knocking on wood, but there was no one there. She turned toward the forest, peering into the darkness. The tapping stopped immediately, as though the listener, whatever it was, had noticed her attention. She walked faster after that. Meanwhile, Bishop Armitage's sermons took on a tone far more severe than usual. He spoke of corruption that wears the mask of innocence, of forces born from human sin but perfected by something older, of voices that speak sweetly in the dark, promising salvation while sowing ruin. The congregation shrank visibly in their pews. Mothers tightened their grip on their children's shoulders. Men who came every Sunday now stared at the bishop with furrowed brows, wondering what had shifted inside him. Afterward, in the sanctuary's dim light, one of the deacons approached him. "Bishop," the man whispered, "your sermon, it troubled some folks." Armitage did not look at him. Instead, he wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold air and said, "Truth should trouble us. That is its purpose." The deacon swallowed. "But you spoke as though something is already here among us." The bishop's jaw tightened. "It is." "Then, what should we do?" Silas Armitage's eyes lifted slowly, and there was a hollow anguish in them the deacon had never seen before. "Pray," he murmured, "and, above all else, do not listen when it calls to you." The deacon opened his mouth, but the bishop walked away before another word could be spoken. By the end of that week, more unsettling signs emerged. A pair of hunters returned from the woods pale as ghosts, claiming they'd found a shackle half buried near the creek. Not unusual. Runaways often fled that route, but this one was open, bent, mangled in a way that suggested immense force. They also found a cloth ribbon, faded gray, tied neatly around a sycamore trunk, like a marker placed for someone familiar with the forest's paths. Worse still, a stable boy swore he saw someone standing in the pasture near the Harrow estate shortly after midnight. A girl in a bonnet, motionless, facing the house with her hands at her sides. He called out to her. She did not move. He stepped closer. She vanished behind a gust of wind so sudden it carried hay from the ground into a swirling dance around his feet. The boy refused to walk that pasture again. By the 10th night, the atmosphere in Amherst County felt strained, taut as a rope pulled between 2 unseen fists. People walked with faster steps. Dogs refused to roam far from porches. Candles burned later in windows. And though no one spoke openly of it, the same question hovered like smoke above every hearth. What had they brought into their town? What had been sold in silence? What had Lot 47 known? And why had so many powerful men seemed afraid of a single veiled girl? These were the first signs, small, scattered, easily dismissed by those who preferred comfort over truth. But soon, the faint unease would turn to fear. Fear would become suspicion. And suspicion would fracture the county wide open. Now, the real story begins. The fear began its slow crawl on a night when the moon hung low and red, as though stained by something it had witnessed. The first true escalation came not from a scream or a confrontation, but from a sound, thin, distant, and unbearably human, echoing across the Harrow estate just after dusk. Naomi heard it while returning from the river. She had gone to fill 2 buckets for the Carter household, though she lingered longer than necessary, letting her reflection ripple in the dark water, hoping it would steady her nerves. But when the cry drifted across the fields, she froze where she stood, gripping the bucket so tightly her knuckles whitened. It wasn't a scream of pain. It sounded like a warning. A sharp, sucking breath, followed by a single word stretched into a shape that barely resembled language. Stop. Then silence. Too total. Too absolute. The night birds ceased their calls. The wind fell dead. Even the river seemed to quiet its rush. Naomi swallowed hard and forced her shaking legs to move. She hurried back toward the quarters, but halfway across the field she sensed movement near the tree line, something pale shifting between the pines. She stopped, blinked, looked again. A figure. Small, female, veiled, watching her. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. Her body screamed to run, but she couldn't. She stood rooted as the figure lifted a hand, slowly, gracefully, and pointed toward Harrow's field, as if indicating some danger she herself was fleeing. Then, without sound, the figure stepped backward into the darkness of the trees and vanished as though devoured by them. Naomi ran until her lungs burned. When she burst into the quarters, Miss Ada clutched her shoulders, shaking her lightly. "What you seen, child? Tell me." Naomi opened her mouth, but only stammered fragments came out. A veil, a hand, the woods swallowing someone whole. Ada's face drained. "Don't go near them harrow trees at night. Not now, not till this thing run its course." "Thing," Naomi whispered. "What thing?" Ada lowered her gaze. "Trouble that come walking." While fear grew among the enslaved, suspicion ballooned like a bruise among the white families of the county. The sheriff, normally a man anchored in routine, began to pace. He questioned his deputies twice daily, asking whether they'd seen anyone at the courthouse after hours. He locked the front door from the inside each evening, something he had never done before. One deputy, Samuel Wright, spoke quietly as the sheriff turned the keys. "You believe someone might come looking for that missing ledger page?" The sheriff didn't look at him. "Someone already did." Samuel stared. "When?" "Last night." The sheriff paused, the key still in the lock. "I heard footsteps in the hall, soft ones. I thought it was you or Clarence. I called out. No one answered." He inhaled shakily. "Then I saw a shadow moving near the clerk's desk, small, like a girl." Samuel forced a laugh. "A girl? In the courthouse? At midnight?" The sheriff didn't laugh. "She was humming." The deputy's smile faltered. "Humming what?" The sheriff turned, meeting Samuel's eyes with something like a dread. "A lullaby my mother used to sing, one I haven't heard since I was 5 years old." He swallowed, voice tightening. "How in God's name would anyone know that?" Samuel looked at him, unsure whether to believe or fear him. "Did you speak to her?" The sheriff shook his head. "I blinked, Sam, just blinked, and she was gone, like smoke." The two men stood in the dim courthouse hall, the lantern flickering between them, both unwilling to linger. At church the next Sunday, unease clung to the congregation like mildew. Women fanned themselves furiously even though the sanctuary was cool. Men shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward the doors as though expecting someone or something to enter unaccompanied. The bishop stepped to the pulpit. Bishop Armitage looked worse than Naomi had ever seen him, his cheeks hollowed, his hands trembling as he opened his Bible. Yet his voice, when he spoke, still possessed that thunderous authority. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "evil does not always come wearing horns and fire. Sometimes it arrives with softness, with sorrow, with a smile." His gaze swept the sanctuary, resting briefly on Edwin Harrow, seated near the front. "Sometimes evil wears a woman's veil." A ripple passed through the pews. Harrow flinched, barely, but enough for the bishop to catch it. The two men locked eyes. The bishop's voice thickened, turning almost accusatory. "Some of you," he thundered, "have brought danger among us, not by malice perhaps, but by arrogance, by presuming you can control what you do not understand." Harrow's jaw tightened. Naomi, seated in the rear with the other enslaved congregants, felt a cold prickle beneath her skin. She glanced at Harrow. His face was pale, his lips a thin line. She had seen him frightened before, but this was different. This was a man terrified of being exposed. When the bishop launched into prayer, Harrow abruptly stood and left the sanctuary, his boots echoing down the aisle. Whispers followed him. After service, the bishop spoke privately with the sheriff behind the church. "You must find that girl," he said through gritted teeth. "I can't find someone who doesn't appear on any record," the sheriff snapped. "You're not listening." The bishop grabbed his arm. "She doesn't need records. She leaves signs." "Signs," the sheriff recoiled. "You talk like an old woman reading omens in tea." The bishop leaned in, voice trembling with intensity. "If we do not find her before she speaks, before she tells, everything you and I know about this county, this church, this world, will burn." The sheriff shook free, staring at the bishop with growing suspicion. "What exactly does she know?" Armitage's face flinched in something like pain, more than she ever should have. "And you," the sheriff whispered, "seem to know more than you're admitting." The bishop's eyes flared, momentarily sharp with something dangerous. "Be careful with that tone." But the sheriff did not back down. For the first time, he saw fear in the bishop's eyes. Not for the town, but for himself. That same night, Naomi found herself drawn again to the river. She didn't want to go, yet something compelled her, an unease that gnawed at her ribs. The moon reflected long and broken across the water. As she knelt to fill the buckets, she heard movement behind her. She spun around. A girl stood on the opposite bank. Not veiled this time. Her face was visible. And she was breathtaking, though not in the way of beauty. Her features were delicate but hollowed, as if carved from sorrow. Her skin carried a faint luminescence beneath the moonlight, something that made Naomi think of fireflies trapped beneath glass. Her eyes, large, dark, and reflective, held a depth unnatural for any human child. Naomi's breath hitched. "Who are you?" The girl tilted her head slightly, studying Naomi as though the question itself confused her. Then she parted her lips. "Listen." The word was faint but unmistakable. A cold wave swept over Naomi. She took a step back. I don't understand." The girl stepped forward. Her feet did not disturb the riverbank. "Listen." "To what?" Naomi whispered. The girl blinked. When she spoke again, her voice held two tones, hers and a second one beneath it, like someone echoing her in perfect synchrony. "They're lying." Naomi's blood ran cold. "Who?" The girl's gaze drifted toward Harrow's field. "All of them." Before Naomi could speak again, a branch snapped behind her. She whirled around, but no one was there. When she turned back, the girl was gone. Only the faint imprint of footprints remained on the mud across the bank, footprints that slowly filled themselves in, as if the earth refused to hold their memory. Naomi stumbled backward, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might burst. She grabbed the buckets and ran. The next morning, two men were found dead near the forest, Robert Pike and Eli Turner, local hunters who often sold game to the Harrow household. Their bodies lay face up, eyes open, mouths twisted in silent terror. There were no wounds, no blood, no signs of struggle. But each man's right hand was smeared with white dust. The same dust found on the shackle the hunters had discovered a week earlier. The doctor examined the bodies and declared the deaths caused by some fright or apoplexy. But his examined calm broke during supper that night when he spoke privately with his wife. "I've seen death my whole career," he whispered, "but never like this. Their faces, it was as though they saw something impossible." "Impossible?" she repeated. The doctor's voice thinned. "Or something they believed impossible, until it wasn't." Rumors exploded after that. People whispered of witchcraft, of curses, of spirits escaped from Harrow's field. Others claimed they heard laughter in the woods, childlike, brittle, and wrong. A woman swore she saw a figure standing outside her window at dawn, veil fluttering despite the still air. A farmer reported his cattle refusing to graze near the southern fence, lowing in distress, circling as though trying to avoid something unseen. The town was unraveling. Suspicion twisted into something sharper, jagged as broken glass. And every thread led back to the same three men. Edwin Harrow, cracking under some secret weight. Bishop Armitage, battling a terror only he seemed to understand. And the sheriff, torn between duty and dread. The people of Amherst County began to choose sides, some believing the powerful were hiding something monstrous, others insisting the strange events were merely hysteria spread by superstitious folk. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Fear dug its nails in. What do you think guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Soon, the county would learn the truth. And the truth would be far worse than madness. It would be revelation. The truth began to unfurl, not with a confession, but with a cracking sound, the splintering of wood, old and swollen with humidity, echoing through Harrow's field just after midnight. Naomi heard it from the Carter quarters, sitting upright in her straw mattress before she even knew why she'd woken. The night was windless. The crickets had gone silent. The air pressed down like a blanket. Then came a second crack, louder, followed by a scream. Not a woman's scream, not sharp or panicked, but the low, guttural wail of a grown man whose courage had shattered. Naomi sprang to her feet. Outside, several others stirred, stepping from their cabins just as another scream, this one choked off mid-breath, rose from the direction of the Harrow estate. Miss Ada grabbed Naomi's wrist. "Don't go near that place, you hear me? Don't you take one step." A lantern flared near the Carter barn. Overseer Tomlin rushed toward the sound, pistol drawn, shouting at two field hands to follow him. They hesitated. Naomi didn't. She slipped into the woods before anyone noticed. The forest felt wrong. The trees leaned inward, their branches forming shapes that watched her pass. The moonlight fell in thin, silver ribbons through the canopy, but each patch of brightness felt like a trap rather than a refuge. The deeper she walked, the more the air vibrated with a sound she couldn't identify, too rhythmic to be wind, too soft to be footsteps. It sounded like breathing, slow, measured, patient. She forced herself onward until the woods thinned and the Harrow house appeared through the trees, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Someone staggered across the porch. Edwin Harrow. His shirt was torn. Blood smeared his left sleeve. He pressed one hand to his ribs and moved with the unsteady gait of a man clinging to consciousness. He reached the edge of the porch steps, grabbed the railing, and vomited onto the ground. Naomi cupped a hand over her mouth. Through the front window, she caught a glimpse of something moving inside the house, something low to the ground, something shifting with fluid, unnatural grace. A silhouette. Small. Female. She ducked behind a tree. Harrow wiped his mouth and murmured to himself, voice trembling. I warned him this would happen." The front door creaked open. Not fully. just enough for a thin sliver of darkness to slide out. Harrow flinched at the sight of it, stumbling backward until he collided with the column. Stay back. I did what I was told. I delivered you. I held my word." The figure stepped forward. Not fully visible, only the hint of a bonnet, the curve of a shoulder, the faint glint of eyes that reflected the porch lantern like an animal's. Harrow whimpered. "Please," he whispered. "I only meant to keep you safe." The veiled girl tilted her head. Then she spoke. "Liar." The word was faint, but it reverberated through Naomi's bones as though shouted beside her ear. Harrow collapsed to his knees. "I didn't want to. Armitage insisted. I tried to bargain. I tried." The girl stepped closer, and the lantern flame flickered violently, shrinking to a needle of light. Harrow shielded his face. "Don't, please don't." The lantern extinguished. Darkness swallowed everything. When the light returned, slowly, hesitantly, it came from a nearby window as a candle inside the house flared back to life. Edwin Harrow was lying on the porch, eyes wide, chest unmoving. Dead. No wound, no mark. Just gone. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She backed away slowly, her heartbeat hammering painfully. But before she could retreat into the woods, someone seized her from behind. A hand clamped over her mouth. "Quiet," a voice whispered. She thrashed until she recognized the smell of pipe smoke and old wool. The sheriff. He released her mouth but kept a hand on her arm. His face was pale, drawn, soaked with sweat. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. I saw her," Naomi whispered. "She killed him." The sheriff swallowed hard. "She's not supposed to, not yet." Naomi stared at him. "You know what she is." "I know enough to fear her," he replied, eyes fixed on Harrow's corpse, "and enough to fear the bishop more." Behind them, a branch snapped. The sheriff spun, gun raised, but the sound came not from the woods, but from the Harrow house. Footsteps. Slow, measured, descending the staircase inside. Naomi's breath grew thin. "She's coming." The sheriff grabbed her arm. "Run." "I can't leave." "Run, girl," he hissed, shoving her toward the woods. "If she sees you now, it's done." Naomi fled. Behind her, the sheriff stepped into the lantern glow, gun shaking in his hand. He stood over Harrow's body and whispered, "Forgive me." Then he pointed the gun toward the open doorway. "Come out," he said. "Show yourself." The house went still. Then a figure appeared. Not the girl. Bishop Armitage. His coat hung open. Sweat soaked the collar of his shirt. His eyes were wide, frantic, pupils dilated like a man possessed. He stepped forward into the lantern glow. "I warned you," he whispered. The sheriff stared. "Where is she?" The bishop's expression tightened with desperation. "If she speaks, everything falls apart. You understand that, don't you? You know why we hid her. You know why her price, her curse, was so high." The sheriff's grip on the gun faltered. "What is she?" Armitage's glance flicked toward the shadowed interior of the house. "A vessel," he murmured. "A door left half open. A whisper that learned how to walk." The sheriff took a step back, voice shaking. "You brought this here. You brought her. You and Harrow. You did this." "A necessary sin," Armitage rasped, "to contain something older than any of us." Naomi, watching from the cover of trees, felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The bishop stepped closer to the sheriff, lowering his voice. "We thought we could silence it." A pause. "But you cannot silence a secret born from a dying tongue." The sheriff's face twisted in horror. "You monster." Armitage's eyes narrowed. "No," he whispered. The monster is behind you." The sheriff froze. For a moment, just a moment, Naomi thought Armitage was lying, manipulating him. Then she saw it. A shape rising behind the sheriff. Small, silent. The veiled girl. She reached out and touched the sheriff's shoulder with a gentleness that made the moment infinitely worse. He gasped. His eyes rolled white. His legs buckled. He dropped beside Harrow, both men lying in identical stillness. The bishop stared at her, at the girl he had once claimed he could control, with something like awe and terror. "You weren't meant to leave the sanctuary," he whispered. The girl tilted her head, veil fluttering though no breeze touched it. "You weren't meant to betray me," she answered. Her voice was layered again, 2 tones, then 3, then many, like multiple throats speaking through one small mouth. Armitage staggered backward, hand gripping his chest. "Please, child, please!" The girl stepped forward, and Naomi heard it, the same sound she'd heard near the river. Breathing. Not human, not singular. A chorus inside a single body. The bishop fell to his knees. "I only wanted to contain what you carry. You know that. You know I—" "Liar," the girl said. The same words she had spoken to Harrow. The effect was instant. Armitage's face contorted. His breath seized. He reached forward as if trying to grasp her hand, but instead he toppled sideways onto the dirt. Motionless. Naomi clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. The girl turned then, slowly, deliberately, her veiled face tilting toward the woods. Toward Naomi. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, Naomi thought the girl saw her, knew her, chose her. But a distant shout from the Carter estate broke the moment. Tomlin and the 2 field hands emerged from the tree line on the east side, lanterns raised, weapons drawn. The girl's head snapped toward them, and the lantern light dimmed as though sucking into her silhouette. Tomlin froze. "What in God's—" He didn't finish. The girl stepped forward, and the men dropped their lanterns. The flames extinguished on impact. 2 stumbling steps backward. A scream. Then the rapid thud of boots as Tomlin and his men fled blindly into the woods, crashing through brush like animals escaping a snare. The girl watched them go. Then her head turned back toward Naomi. And she spoke, not loudly, not threateningly, but with a gentleness that chilled Naomi more than any scream could have. "Listen." Naomi felt tears rise. What do you want from me?" The girl stepped closer. Not threatening, almost pleading. "You can hear what others ignore." Naomi's throat tightened. "Hear what?" The girl lifted a pale hand and touched her own chest. Inside the house behind her, the candlelight trembled violently. "What they put in me," she whispered. "What they feared. What they thought they could bury." Naomi stepped back. The girl followed. "Help me speak." Naomi shook her head fiercely. No, I don't want to be part of this." The girl stopped. "Then you will watch." Naomi froze. The girl lifted her veil, just enough for Naomi to glimpse her eyes. 2 eyes. But behind them more. Countless reflections. As though Naomi were staring into a well filled not with water, but with faces trapped beneath its surface. She stumbled backward. The girl lowered the veil, and darkness, thick and tangible, began to unfurl from her feet like ink spilled across the earth. She stepped backward into it, and vanished. Naomi fled until dawn. When the sun rose, 3 men from the county's most respected institutions lay dead: Harrow, the sheriff, and the bishop. The town erupted. Whispers grew into accusations. Accusations into panic. Men with rifles gathered. Women wept in doorways. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts. Some blamed witchcraft. Others claimed escaped runaways had formed a murderous cult. Still others pointed toward Harrow's estate, insisting the family had consorted with dark forces. Doctors examined the bodies. Priests prayed over them. Journalists arrived from Lynchburg, scribbling furiously. But no one could explain the absence of wounds, or the identical expression of frozen terror on each face, or the white dust found on all three men's right hands. Only Naomi knew the truth. But Naomi also knew this truth would not save her. It would devour her. The revelation was coming. The county was unraveling. And the final, impossible secret of Lot 47 was ready to surface. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. By dawn, word had leapt across Amherst County like a spark on dry brush. 3 men, one a landowner, one a sheriff, one a bishop, were found dead on the same night, on the same patch of soil, with no wounds upon their bodies and no earthly explanation for their final expressions. The news hit the town square before the church bells even rang. Women covered their mouths in horror. Men argued in tight circles, their voices cracking under the strain of fear. Children were quickly ushered indoors. Dogs barked without reason, pacing nervously, reacting to some tremor in the atmosphere that humans could not hear. It was the undertaker who first approached the bodies. A quiet man named Elias Thorne. He had buried generations of Harrows, Armitages, and townsfolk alike. But when he knelt beside Edwin Harrow's corpse, his hands trembled. He had seen death in all its forms: drowning, fever, childbirth, gunshot. But he had never seen terror leaving such deep imprints on a man's face. Harrow's eyes remained open, irises clouded like frost-coated glass. The sheriff's lips were parted, not in a scream, but in the shape of a half-spoken word. Armitage's face was the worst. His expression was twisted by something Elias did not want to name, something that looked like recognition. "What could have done this?" one deputy whispered. Elias shook his head. Not a man, not illness. He wiped his brow, voice barely audible. "Something that looks into you, past you." The deputy took a step back. "You think it was witchcraft?" Elias Thorne did not answer. He didn't have to. The crowd's fear grew teeth. By mid-morning, a Lynchburg journalist arrived, a sharp-eyed man named Auden Pike, whose talent for smelling scandal surpassed even his taste for whiskey. Notebook in hand, he strode around the estate, interviewing anyone who lingered long enough to speak. "What were their relations?" he asked the deputy. "Did Harrow and the bishop quarrel? Did the sheriff perhaps attempt to intervene?" The deputy shook his head. "No quarrel, but something was wrong these past weeks. I swear it. The bishop was losing sleep. Harrow too. Sheriff Harden kept checking on a ledger page gone missing, like he feared what it meant." "A missing page?" Auden's pen stilled. "Whose name was on it?" The deputy swallowed. "No name, just a number, 47. The journalist scribbled furiously. By noon, rumors multiplied. One woman claimed Harrow had been bewitched by a runaway enslaved woman whose singing could charm serpents. Another insisted the bishop had been tainted by forbidden scripture. A third spat on the ground and declared God himself had struck them down. But no one wanted to believe the simplest truth, that 3 powerful men had been afraid, truly, desperately afraid. And fear makes a man vulnerable. Meanwhile, the enslaved community whispered their own truths, quieter, sharper, more accurate. Naomi sat behind the Carter smokehouse, knees drawn to her chest, shaking uncontrollably. Miss Ada found her shortly before sunrise, cradled her, held her as if protecting a child from a storm. "What you got yourself tangled in?" Ada asked softly. Naomi didn't answer. Her lips trembled. Her breath came in small, ragged bursts. "I saw her," she whispered at last. "I saw what she did." Ada stiffened. "Lord Almighty." "She ain't a ghost," Naomi choked out. "She ain't a demon, and she ain't a child." Ada placed a hand over Naomi's mouth, trembling. "Hush, don't say more than you should." But Naomi pulled the hand away. "She's a jail," she said. "A walking jail. And something inside her been waiting to open." Ada stared at her a long moment, her eyes filling. "Oh, child," she murmured, rocking Naomi gently. "Some secrets ain't meant for mortal minds." The magistrate held an emergency inquest that afternoon. 3 bodies, 3 closed casket orders, and one conclusion that satisfied no one. Death by apoplexy induced by fright. The phrase was printed in the Lynchburg Gazette the next morning. The paper also noted signs of trespassing on the Harrow estate and suggested that runaways or vagrants may have intended robbery. No one truly believed it, but the magistrate knew the county would unravel if he spoke truth aloud, and so he pinned the blame on a faceless outsider, someone who could not contradict him from the grave. Even the families of the dead refused to speak openly. Bishop Armitage's sister sobbed through her veil during the funeral, murmuring over and over, He knew it would come back for him." Edwin Harrow's aunt insisted Edwin had been attacked by heart failure, though her eyes darted nervously at every rustle of leaves. The sheriff was buried with a solemn ceremony, but half the congregation stayed home, unwilling to walk the roads after dusk. 3 graves, 3 lies carved into 3 tombstones. And beneath each lie, something darker churned. What about the girl? That question swept the county within 48 hours. Merchants whispered about a veiled figure seen near the river. Children claimed they heard singing at night. One farmer reported seeing a young girl walking along the tree line barefoot, leaving footprints that faded before he reached them. By the 4th night, fear reached fever pitch. A meeting was held at the courthouse, packed beyond capacity. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, sweat beading on their brows despite the cool spring air. They shouted over one another, demanding justice, demanding action, demanding an enemy they could see. One man slammed his fist on a table. "If there's a runaway girl causing all this, we hunt her. Tonight." A chorus of furious agreement rose. But an older man, Reverend Cullum, lifted his hands and shouted them into silence. "You fools," he barked. "You think this is about a girl? You think a slip of a child can kill 3 grown men with no marks upon them?" Someone yelled, "Then what did it, Reverend?" Cullum's hand trembled as he pressed it to the table. "A sin," he whispered. "A sin so deep it took root in this land long before any of you were born." A hush spread through the hall. Cullum's voice fell lower. Harrow and Armitage tried to bury it. Sheriff Hardin tried to keep it quiet. But sins buried in silence always rise, and when they do, he said, his voice cracking, they take payment. For a full minute no one spoke. Then the crowd erupted again, angrier, louder, more desperate. Fear now had no direction, no target, only heat and hunger. By sunrise, search parties formed. Lanterns were lit, guns loaded, dogs loosed. They scoured the woods, the riverbanks, the fields. But no one found the girl. No one found footprints. No one found the veil. What they found instead chilled the blood of every searcher who touched it. A wooden crate, half buried beneath the roots of an old pine. Inside, linen wrappings. The same brittle, yellowed kind once found in the hidden chest, discovered a century later. the same material once used to bind the girl's wrists. The crate's lid bore a familiar brass plate. Lot 47. The men recoiled. No one touched the crate again. A silence heavier than grief settled over the county. In the weeks that followed, people fled Amherst. Families packed wagons. Shopkeepers closed early. Church attendance fell, and by summer, the Harrow estate stood empty. Shutters nailed, floors warped, vines crawling up the once pristine columns. Bishop Armitage's church boarded its windows. The sheriff's badge was placed in a drawer and never reassigned. The county did not recover. Rumors became folklore. Folklore became warning. Warning became silence. And in the decades that followed, the truth of Lot 47 twisted into a ghost story told only behind closed doors. But Naomi never forgot. And she carried her truth, her terrible, impossible truth, until the day she died. The truth buried deeper still, waiting for the moment someone would dig it up, waiting for the moment someone would listen. In the aftermath of the 3 mysterious deaths, Amherst County became a living wound, tender, infected, and unwilling to be touched. What had happened at Harrow's Field refused to fade. It throbbed beneath every whispered conversation, behind every shuttered window, beneath every prayer uttered by trembling lips. The legal proceedings began with speed, as if the county believed that swift bureaucracy could cauterize a supernatural wound. But the truth was that no judge, no magistrate, no coroner wanted to be the one to place his name beside the case. The inquest was held in the courthouse under dim afternoon light. Newspapers from Lynchburg and Richmond sent representatives, notebooks poised, ink bottles ready. But as they waited for testimony, the air in the room grew heavy, as though the walls themselves did not want the truth spoken aloud. The magistrate, a gaunt man named Hewitt Marlowe, read from the sheriff's final notes. His voice quivered despite his attempts at stoicism. Unidentified female, presumed runaway, implicated in irregular occurrences. He paused. That is all. Murmurs rose. That's it? That's all he wrote? No description? No origin? But Marlowe only adjusted his spectacles and continued. Edwin Harrow, deceased, no marks on the body. Bishop Silas Armitage, deceased, no marks. Sheriff Elias Hardin, deceased, no marks. More murmurs, angrier this time. A reporter stood. Sir, the people of this county want an explanation, even a false one. And that, perhaps, was the closest they ever came to truth. An explanation wasn't possible. Even a lie wouldn't stick. All that remained was an empty space where understanding should have been. Within 3 days, the newspapers printed what they dared. The Lynchburg Gazette called the deaths a tragic triad of apoplexy brought on by undue stress. The Richmond Herald blamed a roaming band of runaways practicing strange rites. The Baltimore Sun, further removed and bolder in its language, suggested ritualistic poisoning by a clandestine sect. But local papers stayed silent on the most crucial detail. The missing girl. Lot 47. Someone, whether Marlowe or the Harrow family, or a trembling clerk fearing divine judgment, ordered her complete erasure from local record. Her auction entry vanished. Her transport record vanished. Even the sheriff's earlier mention of a torn page evaporated from the official transcript. As if she had never existed. Except she had. And everyone knew it. Everyone had heard something. A rumor, a lullaby in the woods. A tale whispered by children who didn't understand the danger of repeating what frightened them. A veil seen at dawn. Footprints dissolving on the riverbank. But no one would speak her name. And no one, not even the clergy, would say the word lot. The social divisions that had long simmered now cracked wide open. Slaveholders became paranoid, convinced that rebellion brewed in every whisper. Enslaved families spoke in hushed tones late into the night, crossing themselves with gestures handed down from ancestors who believed the spirit world walked freely alongside the living. A preacher on Fog Hill claimed the county had been marked, punished for sins committed in secret chambers. He pointed to Harrow's field as proof, insisting that the soil was cursed. His congregation dwindled. Those who remained carried weapons even to Sunday service. A new sheriff was appointed, but he refused to take office. "I ain't running toward what killed Hardin," he muttered, packing a single bag and fleeing to his sister's home in North Carolina. For the first time in the county's history, the law had no leader. And the people felt it. They felt exposed, untethered, watched. In the enslaved quarters, life grew tense. Overseer Tomlin, who had fled into the woods the night of the deaths, returned trembling, gaunt, incoherent at times. He raved about a voice whispering from the treetops, about a girl whose shadow moved independently of her feet. He lasted 2 weeks before the Carter family dismissed him, citing mental unfitness. He vanished the next day. Some said he fled the state. Others whispered he walked into the river and never emerged. Naomi watched all of this with a quiet dread. She dreamed of the girl, always standing still, always watching, always pointing toward Harrow's house. Naomi could not decide whether the girl was warning her or inviting her. The thin line between fear and fascination blurred until Naomi couldn't sleep without lighting a candle beside her bed. Miss Ada kept a close eye on her. One night she touched Naomi's cheek and whispered, "You're carrying too much truth. That kind of burden hollows out a person." Naomi tried to speak her fears, but the words never formed fully. Every time she attempted to describe the girl's voice, the memories tangled. The layered tones, the eyes with too many reflections. The secret lodged inside Naomi like a thorn. And the thorn would never come out. By the end of the summer, Amherst County stood half abandoned. The Harrow estate rotted. The bishop's church fell into disrepair. The courthouse hung a single lantern at night, though few dared walk past after dusk. The story of Lot 47 became a whispered warning told by mothers to keep children close, by farmhands to ward off evil, by enslaved elders to remind the young that danger wears many shapes. Some said she had been a conjure girl. Others said she had been possessed. A few believed she had been created, crafted by men who meddled where they had no right. But the most terrifying belief was the one spoken only once, by Miss Ada, on a humid night when Naomi sat trembling beside her. Ada whispered, "They didn't buy her. They bought what lived inside her." And this idea, the most impossible of all, quietly rooted itself into the county's collective memory. Years passed. The Civil War came and went. Slavery fell, but the scars remained. New families bought the land. Old families left and never returned. But the story never died. Sometimes, a hunter near the river would claim to see a veiled girl moving between trees. Sometimes, elders told children not to follow voices in the woods, no matter how sweetly they called. And always, the people of Amherst County refused to speak the number 47. Even in the 20th century, when historians arrived trying to piece together the fragments of the Harrow estate, locals shut their doors. One old man, asked about the subject in 1923, simply said, "There are some stories that don't want telling. Some truths stay buried because they're still alive." And then he closed the door. But history does not stay buried forever. Not when roots grow beneath it. Not when voices whisper through generations. Not when one artifact, wrapped in brittle linen and sealed in a forgotten chest, holds a secret too large for silence. A secret that was never supernatural. A secret that was never a curse. A secret that was human, manufactured, hidden, and sold. The impossible truth of Lot 47 would not remain in the grave forever. It was waiting for the moment someone would open the last door, waiting for the moment someone, like you, would listen. In the end, the story of Lot 47 did not dissolve into myth. It calcified, settling into the bones of Amherst County like a quiet infection time could not purge. Those who lived through it never forgot what they saw. Those who came after felt its presence in subtler ways. An uneasiness near the Harrow ruins, a reluctance to walk the riverbank after dusk, a silence that fell whenever the number 47 slipped unintentionally into conversation. History tries to tidy its corners, to explain what it fears, to sanitize what it cannot prove. But some stories resist. They breathe. They return. They wait to be found by hands willing to disturb the dust. So now the question becomes yours. What do you believe happened in Amherst County? Was the truth finally revealed? Or was it buried to protect the powerful, the fearful, and the guilty? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep unearthing America's darkest forgotten histories, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. Your support keeps these shadows from being forgotten.